I'm Liam Carter, 46 male. I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood where the biggest drama is usually who has the greenest lawn. For the last 15 years, I've dedicated my life to building a company and providing for my family. But in a single afternoon, the man I built that company with decided I was disposable. He was about to find out how wrong he was. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. 15 years is a long time. It's long enough to build a life, a family, and a company from the ground up. My wife Chloe and I bought our house in this neighborhood when our son Daniel was still a toddler. It's a simple two-story colonial with a big oak tree in the front yard, the kind of place where you measure time in growth charts penciled onto a doorframe. For 15 years, I left this house every morning before the sun was fully up and often returned long after it had set, all in service of an idea. That idea was called Aperture Logistics. When I first met Julian Vance, he was all charisma and ambition, armed with a freshly printed MBA and a PowerPoint presentation full of buzzwords. He had a vision for revolutionizing the supply chain industry but lacked one critical component: someone who could actually build the technology to make it happen. That's where I came in. Fresh out of the Army Signal Corps, I had spent 6 years designing and maintaining secure communication networks in places where a single point of failure wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a life-or-death liability. I knew how to build systems that were resilient, secure, and unflappable under pressure. We started in a cramped, rented office space that always smelled faintly of burnt coffee. Julian wooed investors with grand promises while I sat in the corner with a laptop, turning his abstract concepts into millions of lines of code. The result was Nexus, a logistics and supply chain management platform that would become the core of Aperture Logistics. Nexus wasn't just a piece of software, it was the company's central nervous system. I designed its architecture, coded its core protocols, and embedded security measures learned from my time in the military. It was my creation, my professional legacy. For years, Julian treated me like a partner. In every investor meeting, I was Liam, our brilliant architect, the backbone of this entire operation. He loved telling them about my military background, painting a picture of a disciplined veteran building an unbreachable fortress of technology. It was a good story, and it made people write big checks. Our little startup grew into a multi-million-dollar corporation with hundreds of employees and a gleaming headquarters downtown. I eventually became the head of engineering, and while the title was nice, my role never really changed. I was the keeper of Nexus, the one person who understood its every secret, its every strength, and its every vulnerability. My life settled into a comfortable rhythm, challenging work, a loving family, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had built something that mattered. But about 8 months ago, the rhythm began to change. The shift was subtle at first. Julian started holding strategic meetings without me. My access to certain financial projections was quietly revoked. When I'd walk into the break room, conversations would stop and people would suddenly find somewhere else to be. It was a classic corporate freeze-out. I'd heard stories about it from friends in the industry. It's what companies do when they want to get rid of a senior, highly paid employee without the messiness of a direct confrontation. They isolate you, make you feel irrelevant, and hope you'll just quit. I wasn't the type to just quit. My training in the Signal Corps had taught me to analyze threats, anticipate enemy movements, and always have a contingency plan. In the corporate world, the threats weren't mortars or ambushes, but they could be just as devastating to your life. So I started my own quiet reconnaissance. I paid closer attention to hallway conversations, to the new faces being brought in for interviews, and to the documents left on the printer. The final piece of intelligence arrived 3 weeks ago. I found a draft employment contract for a kid named Kevin, fresh out of university with a computer science degree. His proposed salary was a third of mine. His job description was a near-verbatim copy of my own responsibilities, just rephrased with the latest corporate jargon. That's when I knew my time was limited. Julian wasn't just planning to replace me, he was trying to erase me. I saw him in a meeting with the marketing team, reviewing a new company history presentation where my name had been systematically removed from the founding story. He was trying to rewrite history to position himself as the sole genius behind Aperture Logistics. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than any financial calculation. He was trying to steal my legacy. But what Julian, with his fancy business degree and slick suits, failed to understand about a man trained by the US Army is that we always prepare for the worst-case scenario. We build redundancies into our plans, we establish fallback positions, and we never ever leave ourselves without an exit strategy. Years ago, during a system-wide security upgrade for Nexus, I had embedded a final, ultimate failsafe. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't a virus or a worm. It was a protective protocol, a digital dead man's switch. The logic was simple. If my administrative credentials, the highest level access in the entire system, were ever revoked without a specific sequenced authorization from me, Nexus would interpret it as a hostile takeover. It would assume its core architect had been compromised and would initiate a full systemic lockdown to protect its own integrity and the data of our clients. It wouldn't delete anything. It would simply go dark, hibernating until the proper authority could be reestablished. My authority. The summons came via sterile email from Julian's executive assistant. Mandatory senior staff meeting 4:00 p.m. conference room 3. There was no agenda attached. There never was for meetings like this. I knew exactly what it was. This was the execution. As I walked down the long, carpeted hallway toward the glass-walled conference room, I felt a strange sense of calm. The anxiety and uncertainty of the past few months had vanished, replaced by a cold, clear focus. My military training had kicked in. When you're facing a critical event, emotion is a luxury you can't afford. You assess, you calculate, and you act. I saw them through the glass before I even opened the door. Julian Vance sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, looking every bit the triumphant CEO. To his left sat Mark Jennings, our CTO, a man who had once been a technical peer but had long since become a corporate yes-man. He refused to make eye contact with me. Across from him was Dr. Elena Rios, our director of operations. A sharp, no-nonsense Air Force veteran, she was one of the few people in the company I genuinely respected. Her expression was unreadable, but I saw a flicker of something, discomfort, maybe even regret in her eyes. A few junior executives, eager to be seen in the halls of power, filled the other chairs. I took the empty seat directly opposite Julian and waited. The silence was heavy, broken only by the quiet hum of the climate control system. Julian let it stretch, a petty power play designed to make me squirm. Finally, he straightened his ridiculously expensive tie and gave me a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Liam, thank you for coming," he began, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "As you know, the market is constantly evolving, and in order to stay competitive, Aperture has to make some difficult strategic decisions. We're restructuring some departments to better align with our future goals." I just stared at him, my expression neutral. I wasn't going to make this easy for him. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He cleared his throat and slid a thin, white envelope across the table. It stopped perfectly in front of me. "As part of this restructuring," he continued, "your position as head of engineering has been eliminated. Your termination is effective immediately." I looked at the envelope, then back at him. Inside my mind, a clock started ticking, not a clock of panic, but a clock of execution. My son Daniel's first tuition payment for his engineering program was due in less than a month. Chloe's specialized medication, the one our insurance barely covered, needed a refill next week. The mortgage on our home, the place where we'd raised our son, had another decade left on it. These weren't fears, they were mission parameters. They were the objectives I needed to protect. "I see," I said, my voice even. The junior executives around the table shifted uncomfortably. They were watching a man's career be dismantled, and they were treating it like a spectator sport. Elena, however, looked directly at me. Her military training was showing. She knew how to keep a stoic face in a tense situation, but her eyes conveyed a message of disapproval. Julian seemed annoyed by my lack of an emotional outburst. He wanted a scene, something to validate his decision and paint me as unstable. I wasn't going to give it to him. "We appreciate your contributions over the years, Liam," he said, the words sounding hollow and rehearsed. "The severance package is quite generous, I think you'll find." I didn't touch the envelope. Instead, I slowly unclipped the ID badge from my belt and placed it gently on the table. The plastic card made a soft clicking sound against the polished wood. "Julian," I said, letting his name hang in the air for a moment. The room went completely still. "I think you've made a serious miscalculation." He chuckled, a short, arrogant bark of a laugh. "I don't think so, Liam. This is business." "Is it?" I asked. I stood up, pushing my chair back quietly. I looked around the table, meeting the eyes of each person there. Mark Jennings flinched and looked down at his notepad. The junior execs looked away. Only Elena held my gaze. "I would advise you to pull up the Nexus System Integrity Dashboard," I said, my voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. "There's a countdown that just started. And I don't think you're going to like what happens when it hits 0. A ripple of confusion went through the room. Julian's smirk finally vanished, replaced by a deep frown. "What are you talking about? What did you do?" he demanded, his voice rising. I gave him a small, cold smile, the kind of smile a soldier gives when their trap has just been sprung. "I didn't do anything, Julian. You did. You just gave the order to revoke my credentials." I picked up the small cardboard box they had left by the door for my personal effects, a pathetic corporate tradition. Inside were a framed photo of Chloe and Daniel, my old Army Signal Corps mug, and a small flag Daniel had made for me in elementary school. As I turned to leave, I saw the panic finally starting to set in. Mark was fumbling to open his laptop. One of the junior execs was already on his phone, likely calling it. Julian was on his feet, his face turning a blotchy red. "You have 8 minutes," I said from the doorway. Then I stepped out into the hall and let the door swing shut behind me. The walk from that conference room to the elevator felt like moving through a different dimension. The normal office chatter seemed distant and muffled, and the people I passed at their desks blurred into the background. My mind was a flurry of activity, but it was an organized, methodical flurry. I wasn't thinking about the sting of betrayal anymore. I was running through checklists, confirming timelines, and anticipating the cascading effects of the protocol I had set in motion. The contingency plan I had hoped I would never have to use was now active, and every step had been meticulously planned. As I rode the elevator down to the parking garage, my phone began to buzz incessantly. A quick glance showed a flood of calls from office extensions. I silenced it and slipped it into my pocket. It was crucial that they stew in their own mess for a while. They needed to understand the full scope of their powerlessness before I would even consider speaking to them. They needed to feel the consequences of their actions. Driving out of the city, I deliberately took the scenic route, tracing the river that cut through the valley. The afternoon sun glinted off the water, and for the first time in months I felt the tight knot of anxiety in my chest begin to loosen. The waiting and wondering were over. The other shoe had finally dropped, and now it was my turn to act. My thoughts drifted back to the moment I knew this day was inevitable. It was a late Tuesday night about a month ago. I'd come back to the office to retrieve a file I'd forgotten, and the building was mostly empty. As I passed Julian's office, I saw his screen was still on. He'd forgotten to lock it. On the monitor was an email chain between him and a venture capitalist from a rival firm, Summit Ventures. The subject line was Project Phoenix. My blood ran cold as I read the first few lines. Julian was outlining a plan to decouple the asset from its primary dependency. I was the primary dependency. He was talking about me. The email went on to detail a strategy for cloning the Nexus source code onto an external server and creating a new, rebranded company with Summit's backing, effectively stealing the entire intellectual property of Aperture Logistics. He was planning to burn down the company we had built together, take the only thing of value, my Nexus system, and leave the employees and other investors with nothing but a hollow shell. The contract for the cheap replacement and the attempts to scrub my name from the company's history were just the preliminary steps. His real plan was grand larceny on a corporate scale. That was the moment my contingency planning shifted from a defensive, what-if scenario to an active counteroffensive. He wasn't just trying to fire me, he was a threat to the entire company and everyone who depended on it. My failsafe protocol was no longer just about protecting my own interests. It was about protecting the integrity of my creation and the jobs of hundreds of employees who had no idea their CEO was a corporate pirate. Seeing that email was like discovering a detailed map of an enemy's planned attack. It allowed me to prepare my defenses with absolute precision. I had spent the last few weeks quietly ensuring that my lockdown protocol was flawless and untraceable to any form of sabotage. It would look like a catastrophic system failure, but one that only the original architect could possibly understand and reverse. I pulled into my driveway just as the timer on my watch beeped. 4:32 p.m. Right on schedule. At that exact moment, across the city, across the country, and across the world, every single instance of the Nexus platform went dark. The global shipping clients who relied on it to track their fleets would see their maps go blank. The warehouses that used it to manage their inventory would find their systems frozen. The entire digital infrastructure of Aperture Logistics, a company valued at nearly $500 million, had just ceased to exist. It was now nothing more than an expensive letterhead. I imagined Julian staring at a screen full of error messages, the color draining from his face as he realized this wasn't a simple server crash. I pictured the IT department scrambling, trying to reboot systems that would not respond, their every effort futile. The system wasn't broken, it was asleep. And I was the only one who could wake it up. The house was quiet. Chloe was at her weekly book club meeting and Daniel was at soccer practice. I walked into my home office, the one I had built with the bonus from the first big contract Nexus had landed. I sat in my comfortable leather chair, the silence of the house a stark contrast to the chaos I knew was unfolding downtown. I powered down my work phone and placed it in a drawer. Then I turned on my personal laptop and started researching tuition payment plans for Daniel's university. I had to stay focused on the mission. This wasn't about revenge, it was about securing my family's future and taking back what was rightfully mine. An hour passed. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns of my neighborhood. I felt a sense of peace. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to Julian's moves. I was in control. The silence was finally broken by the sound of the doorbell. It was a firm, deliberate ring. I knew it wouldn't be Julian, not yet. He would be too proud, still trying to solve the problem through brute force and intimidation. This would be his envoys. Back at Aperture Logistics headquarters, the atmosphere had devolved from controlled panic to outright chaos. The moment the first critical system alerts had flashed across the monitors in the Network Operations Center, it was clear this was no ordinary outage. It started with the client-facing portals, which suddenly returned 404 errors. Then, the internal dashboards went black. Within minutes, every single server that ran a component of the Nexus platform became unresponsive. The phones lit up like a Christmas tree, with calls flooding in from clients, partners, and international offices. The company, for all intents and purposes, had vanished from the internet. Julian Vance was a man coming undone. He stormed through the IT department, shouting orders at technicians who were already working frantically. "Reboot the servers, restore from backup, why isn't anything working?" he yelled, his voice echoing in the cavernous, climate-controlled server room, but every attempt to revive the system failed. The servers would power on, but the software itself, the complex, living entity that was Nexus, refused to initialize. It was like trying to start a car that had no engine. Mark Jennings, the CTO, was sweating profusely, his face pale as he stared at a screen full of incomprehensible error logs. He had been the CTO for 5 years, but he had only a surface-level understanding of Nexus's deep architecture. He managed budgets and personnel. He hadn't written a line of code in over a decade. He was utterly, hopelessly out of his depth. Amid the chaos, Dr. Elena Rios remained an island of calm. While others were running around in headless chicken mode, she was methodically gathering information. Her Air Force logistics training had taught her that in a crisis, the first step is to accurately define the problem. She pulled 2 of the top network engineers into a quiet office away from Julian's shouting. "Forget what's not working," she said, her voice sharp and clear. "Tell me exactly what the system is doing." One of the engineers, a young but brilliant woman named Maya, pulled up a low-level diagnostic screen. "It's not crashing, Dr. Rios," she said, pointing to a scrolling line of code. "It's not throwing normal error messages. It's executing a shutdown command. It's a clean, orderly lockdown. Every subroutine is terminating in a specific sequence. This isn't a failure. This is a procedure." Alina felt a chill run down her spine. A procedure, that word changed everything. This wasn't an accident, this was deliberate. Her mind immediately went to the scene in the conference room less than an hour ago. Liam's final words echoed in her ears. "There's a countdown that just started." She looked at Mark, who had just entered the office looking defeated. "Mark," she said, "When exactly were Liam Carter's credentials revoked?" Mark fumbled with his tablet. "At 4:32 p.m. on Julian's direct order, the system automatically terminated all his access permissions." Alina pointed to the main diagnostic screen. "And when did the shutdown sequence initiate?" Maya checked the master log. "At 4:32 p.m. exactly." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't sabotage, it was a failsafe, a dead man's switch. Liam, the man they had just unceremoniously cast aside, had built his own self-destruct, or rather, self-preservation, sequence into the heart of the company. Mark's face went white. "The Sentinel Protocol," he whispered, a memory surfacing from years ago. "Liam briefed us on it during a security review. He called it a last-resort defense against a hostile internal or external takeover. If the system's architect was ever compromised or removed without authorization, it would enter a protected state." Alina swore under her breath. And Julian just told the entire system that its architect was compromised. She pulled out her phone and started dialing Liam's number. It went straight to voicemail. She tried again, voicemail. She sent a text, "Liam, call me, urgent, no response." The full weight of their situation began to crash down on them. They hadn't just fired their best engineer. They had triggered a corporate doomsday device of his own design, and he was the only person on Earth with the key to disarm it. Julian stormed into the office, his face a mask of fury. "What is going on? Why has nobody fixed this?" Alina looked at him, her expression grim. "Nobody can fix it, Julian," she said. "This wasn't a system failure, it was a security feature. You fired the one man who can turn it back on." Julian stared at her, his mind struggling to process the information. "Get him on the phone," he roared. "Now." Alina held up her own phone. "He's not answering, not for me, not for Mark, not for anyone." The reality was dawning on them all. They were locked out of their own company, and the man they had just thrown out held all the keys. As the financial losses began to mount by the millions with each passing minute, a new, desperate plan began to form. They couldn't call him. They had to go to him. While Aperture Logistics was imploding, my evening was proceeding with a placid, almost surreal sense of normalcy. Daniel got home from soccer practice, dropped his gear by the door, and immediately raided the refrigerator. He's a good kid, smart and thoughtful, with a passion for engineering that makes me incredibly proud. He was in the middle of telling me about his physics project when my personal cell phone, the one with a number only a handful of people have, began to ring. It was Alina. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, a text popped up. "Liam, we are on our way to your house. We need to talk, please." "Everything okay, Dad?" Daniel asked, noticing the look on my face. "You seem different today, good different," I smiled. "Kids are more perceptive than we give them credit for. Everything's fine, son, just dealing with a big project at work. The kind where you have to fix everyone else's mistakes," he asked with a grin. I chuckled. Something like that. I knew this was a teaching moment, a chance to impart a lesson more valuable than any textbook could offer. "Hey, let me ask you something," I said, leaning against the kitchen counter. "In your engineering classes, you talk about stress points and structural integrity, right?" He nodded, intrigued. "Well, the same principles apply to people and organizations. You always have to know your own value. You have to build your life and career with enough integrity that you can withstand pressure, and you never, ever let someone else tell you what you're worth." He absorbed that, his expression serious. "Like that story you told me from the army," he said, "about building the communications array and making it redundant so a single failure couldn't take the whole thing down." "Exactly," I said, my heart swelling with pride. "That's my boy. You build things right and you build them to last." The doorbell rang precisely 20 minutes later. Through the peephole, I saw two familiar figures standing on my porch under the warm glow of the evening light, Alina Rios and Mark Jennings. They both looked like they had aged a decade in the last 2 hours. Alina's professional composure was still intact, but her shoulders were slumped with exhaustion. Mark just looked terrified. I took a deep breath and opened the door. "Alina, Mark, this is an unexpected visit," I said, my tone polite but firm. Alina met my gaze directly. "No games, no pretense," I respected that. "Liam, can we come in? We need your help. It's a catastrophe." I considered them for a moment. They had both been in that room. They had both sat by and watched Julian sever my career, but I also knew they were caught in the crossfire. "Shoes off," I said, stepping aside. I shuffled into the foyer, looking around my home as if it were a foreign country. I led them into the living room. "Have a seat," I said, gesturing to the couch. As they sat, Daniel poked his head around the corner. I gave him a slight nod. "Why don't you head upstairs and get a start on that homework, champ? We can talk about the project later." He got the message and disappeared upstairs. I sat in the armchair opposite them, clasping my hands and waiting. In any negotiation, the first person to show desperation loses leverage. They were on my turf in my home, asking for my help. The ball was entirely in my court. Mark predictably broke first. "Liam, Nexus is completely dark," he stammered. "The entire global network. Clients are threatening lawsuits. The board is in an emergency session. We're hemorrhaging money. This could bankrupt the company." I nodded slowly as if hearing this for the first time. "That sounds serious," I said. Alina leaned forward, cutting through Mark's panicked rambling. "We know this wasn't an attack, Liam. We figured it out. The Sentinel Protocol. Mark remembered you briefing us on it years ago. It's a security lockdown tied to your credentials." "I'm impressed you remembered," I said. "It's not a bug, it's a feature. I designed it to protect the system's integrity from any unauthorized attempt to seize control. When Julian terminated my access, the system did exactly what it was built to do. It defended itself." "So you can fix it?" Mark asked, his voice full of a desperate hope. "You can bring it back online?" I stood up and walked over to my desk where my personal laptop was sitting. I opened it and, using a secure back channel I had built for myself years ago, I pulled up the Nexus status screen. It was a sea of red alerts and critical failure warnings. I turned the screen toward them. The raw data of their corporate apocalypse was reflected in their wide eyes. "Bringing it back online isn't the issue," I said, closing the laptop. "The system is stable and the data is secure. It's essentially in a medically induced coma. The real issue is defining the terms under which I would be willing to wake it up." Alina's expression hardened slightly as she understood. This wasn't a rescue mission, it was a negotiation. "What are your terms?" she asked. I looked her straight in the eye. "My terms aren't for you. My terms are for Julian. He's the one who put a price on my 15 years of work. Now I'm going to put a price on his company's survival." I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. "He wants to talk to me. He does it here in my home. He wants his company back. He will come here and ask for it properly." Alina's jaw was tight, but she nodded. She knew this was the only way. She pulled out her phone and dialed Julian. I could hear his panicked, tinny voice through the earpiece when he answered. She listened for a moment, then said, "He's here, Julian, and he'll talk, but you need to come to his house now, and I suggest you come prepared to make a deal." Less than 30 minutes later, the quiet suburban peace of my street was shattered by the squeal of tires. Julian's sleek black sports car took the corner too fast, its headlights cutting a frantic path across my neighbor's lawn. He slammed the car into park and stormed toward my front door, looking like a man whose world was actively burning down around him. He didn't bother with the doorbell, instead hammering on the door with his fist. I let him knock again, a small but satisfying exercise in control. On the third, more frantic round of pounding, I opened the door. Stood there disheveled and wild-eyed. His perfect suit was wrinkled, his tie was askew, and the arrogant smirk he wore like a second skin was gone, replaced by a mask of raw fear and fury. "Turn it on," he hissed, trying to shove past me into the house. I held my ground, blocking the doorway with my body. "Good evening, Julian. Having a stressful night?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm, his face contorted with rage. "Don't play games with me, Carter. This is sabotage. I'll have you arrested." "The FBI will be breaking down this door." I stepped aside, gesturing him in. "Careful, Julian. You're making serious accusations in front of witnesses," I said, nodding toward Alina and Mark, who were standing nervously in the living room. "You might want to lower your voice before you say something you can't take back." He strode into the room, his eyes darting around as if looking for a server rack to reboot. He rounded on me, jabbing a finger in my face. "You did this, you deliberately destroyed my company." Before I could respond, Alina stepped forward. "Actually, Julian, he didn't," she said, her voice firm. "The logs are clear. You terminated his credentials, which triggered a pre-existing security protocol, a protocol he designed to protect the company's intellectual property." Mark, holding up his tablet, added, "The audit trail is ironclad." This wasn't an act of sabotage. The system performed exactly as it was designed to under these specific circumstances. Julian's face went slack. The fight seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a dawning, horrified understanding. He had been so focused on his own cleverness that he had never considered that I might be 10 steps ahead of him. "Security protocol," he mumbled, looking for a way to deny it. "The one I briefed you and the board on during the 2018 annual security review," I said, my voice sharp. "The one you dismissed as paranoid before leaving early for a golf game." I walked to the coffee table and laid out a thin file folder I had prepared. "But since we're on the subject of corporate security, Julian, let's talk about a real breach." I opened the folder and spread out the contents. They were printouts of his emails with Summit Ventures, printouts of his Project Phoenix plan, printouts of the server logs showing his unauthorized attempts to copy the Nexus source code to an external drive. I had found everything. Alina and Mark leaned forward, their eyes scanning the documents. I saw Alina's face harden with disgust and Mark's pale with fear. They were looking at concrete proof of their CEO's attempt to commit grand-scale corporate theft. This isn't what it looks like," Julian stammered, but the words were hollow. The evidence was irrefutable. "Really?" I said, tapping one of the emails. "Because this looks exactly like you planning to gut Aperture Logistics, steal its core asset, my asset, and start a new company, leaving your employees and investors with nothing. So don't you dare talk to me about sabotage." Julian finally collapsed into an armchair, the last of his bluster gone. He looked small and defeated. "What do you want?" he whispered. I took a moment, glancing toward the hallway where my son's bedroom was. I was fighting for him, for his future, for the life Chloe and I had worked so hard to build. "What I want," I said, turning back to him, "is for the man who built this company to be treated with the respect he is owed. And I want to be compensated for what you tried to steal from me." "How much?" he asked, his voice barely audible. I had the numbers ready. "First, reinstatement as Chief Technology Officer effective immediately. Second, a permanent seat on the board of directors. Third, a 25% equity stake in the company. Fourth, personal compensation of $7 million for attempted intellectual property theft and breach of contract. And finally, a company-wide memo, written by you, publicly acknowledging my role as the sole architect of the Nexus platform." His head snapped up. "That's insane. I can't give you 25% of the company." "Julian," Alina said quietly, her voice like ice, 25% of something is a lot better than 100% of a bankrupt shell, which is what we will be by morning." Mark was furiously tapping on his phone. "He's right, Julian. Our biggest client just formally announced they are pulling their contract. The financial hit from that alone will trigger default clauses with our creditors. We have hours, maybe less. And they'll walk," I added calmly. "In fact, their CTO reached out to me directly this evening with a very generous job offer. It seems they'd rather hire the man who built the system than stay with the company that was stupid enough to fire him." The finality of his situation crashed down on Julian. He was trapped, outmaneuvered, and utterly beaten. His hands were shaking. He looked from the damning evidence on my coffee table to the determined faces of his senior staff to me, the man holding all the cards. "Fine," he breathed, the word tasting like poison in his mouth. "Draft the paperwork," I smiled grimly. Already did. I pulled a professionally drafted contract from the folder. All the terms were laid out in precise, legally binding language. All it needs is your signature. He stared at the pen as if it were a venomous snake. Then with a shuddering sigh he took it and signed his name, his hand trembling. With that single stroke he had not just saved his company, he had signed away his absolute power. "It's done," he said, pushing the contract back at me. I looked at his signature, then met his eyes. "No, Julian," I said. "Now it's just beginning. Welcome to the partnership." The next morning I walked through the doors of Aperture Logistics not as a terminated employee, but as the new CTO and a quarter owner of the company. The change in the atmosphere was immediate and palpable. The whispers didn't stop when I walked by, they were about me, but they were no longer whispers of pity. They were whispers of awe, respect, and a little bit of fear. The memo from Julian had already gone out, acknowledging my foundational role in the company's success and announcing my new position. It was a masterclass in corporate groveling, and everyone in the building had read it. My first act was to call an emergency board meeting. I walked into the same glass-walled conference room where I had been fired less than 24 hours earlier. This time I didn't take a seat on the side. I took the one right next to Julian at the head of the table. The other board members, who had likely been fed a sanitized version of events, looked at me with a mixture of confusion and apprehension. "As of this morning, the Nexus platform is fully operational," I began, my voice clear and confident. "All client services have been restored and system integrity is at 100%. The outage was the result of a security protocol I designed years ago to protect the company from a hostile internal takeover. It worked exactly as intended." I let that sink in before continuing. "It has become clear that our previous leadership structure had some critical vulnerabilities. As a new partner and board member, my first priority is to ensure the long-term stability and security of our core assets." For the next hour, I laid out a new technical roadmap for the company, one that focused on innovation and security rather than short-sighted cost-cutting. I spoke with the authority of someone who not only understood the technology but now owned a significant piece of it. Julian sat beside me silent and grim-faced, occasionally nodding in agreement when I looked his way. He had no choice. I had him and he knew it. After the meeting, Alina asked to speak with me privately in her office. She closed the door and turned to me, her expression serious. "Liam, that was an impressive display of strategic maneuvering, military grade. Just contingency planning," I said. She hesitated for a moment. "I want to apologize for sitting there in that room and not saying anything. We all thought Julian had a plan. We were wrong to trust his judgment over our own instincts." "I appreciate that, Alina," I said. "In my world, owning your mistakes was a sign of strength. From now on, this company will be run on transparency and competence. I'm going to need people I can trust." "You'll have it," she said, extending a hand. "Welcome back, partner." We shook on it, a new alliance forged in the fires of a corporate crisis. That evening when I got home, the atmosphere was completely different. Chloe met me at the door with a hug that lingered. "So," she said, a smile playing on her lips, "Daniel tells me you executed a strategic corporate takeover and reclaimed your rightful throne. He's been looking up cybersecurity programs all afternoon." I laughed, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. "He has a flair for the dramatic. He's proud of you, Liam." "We both are," she said, her voice soft. "Not just for the money or the title, but for standing up for your own worth. You showed him what integrity looks like." Later that week, I was in my home office when my personal phone rang. It was an unknown number, a New York area code. "Liam Carter speaking." "Mr. Carter," a smooth voice on the other end said. "This is Troy Aldridge from Summit Ventures. I believe you're familiar with our firm." I leaned back in my chair. "The name sounds familiar." "You're the ones who were working with Julian Vance on a little side project, weren't you?" There was a brief, surprised silence. "I see you're well informed. In that case, perhaps we can be direct. We are still very interested in the Nexus technology. With your new leadership position, perhaps we could discuss a more formal partnership." I almost laughed. The audacity was incredible. "Let me be direct, Troy," I said, my voice turning to steel. "Aperture Logistics and its intellectual property are not for sale. Any further attempts to contact our employees or interfere with our business will be met with immediate and aggressive legal action, complete with a very public disclosure of your firm's unethical business practices. Am I making myself clear?" The line was quiet for a long moment. "Perfectly," he said, his voice now cold. "You'll be hearing from our lawyers." "No, you'll be hearing from mine," I replied and hung up. 6 months later, Aperture Logistics was thriving. Our stock price was at an all-time high, driven by the new security and innovation initiatives I had implemented. Julian was still CEO, but his power was checked. He was humbled, more collaborative, and for the first time seemed to understand that a company's greatest asset is its people. My family's future was secure. Daniel was accepted into his first-choice engineering program, his tuition paid in full. Chloe's medical needs were covered under a new executive health plan. We were safe. Sometimes I sit on my back porch and think about the events of that crazy week. They tried to erase 15 years of my life's work. They tried to tell me I was just a disposable part of their machine. Instead, they forced me to quantify my own value. And it turns out my value was a $7 million check, a quarter of the company, and the profound satisfaction of knowing I had not only won, but had done so by staying true to the principles I had learned long ago. Always be prepared, know your worth, and build things to last.